Welcome to the RSM Talk Big podcast.
Is a road user charge fairer than a fuel tax? And could this inadvertently discourage sustainable practices by individuals and businesses? Back in August, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers held an economic forum roundtable where, among other things, they discussed a new road tax to raise revenue from those not paying fuel excise. EVs, or electric vehicles. While it's clear the federal government intends to move forward with the new tax, we're missing a lot of details on who it will apply to, whether it will be weighted and how it will be paid. Hello, I'm Andrew Sykes. I've been a business accountant for over 25 years. I talk about business, money and the economy to help you get ahead. Welcome to Talk Big. Today we're going to talk about why the government wants a road user charge to tax EVs, how it might be implemented, and whether this is the best way forward for Australia. When we consider the government's announcement of a new 2035 emissions reduction target of 62 to 70% below 2005 levels, is this charge another step towards achieving that goal, or will it actually discourage road users from adopting more sustainable practice? Joining me from Brisbane, I have RSM Australia's National Head of Tax, Sam Mohammad, and RSM Australia's National Sustainability Lead, Nicole Mohan. Welcome both Sam and Nicole. How are you today?
Lovely to be here. Thanks, Andrew.
Good, thanks as well.
Joining from sunny, warm Brisbane. So a little bit about Sam. So Sam has close to 20 years experience advising on indirect taxes like GST and the fuel tax levy. He's a prior member of the ATO's Fuel Tax Liaison Group and a regular presenter at the Tax Institute and other seminars and conferences. Sam's a current member of the Tax Institute of Queensland's State Taxes Subcommittee, so well qualified to talk to us today. And from the sustainability angle, Nicole has over 15 years of experience working for RSM in both Australia and Los Angeles. As RSM's National Sustainability Lead, she plays a key role in driving RSM's sustainability goals and is a registered greenhouse and energy auditor. Nicole's managed numerous engagements for the Clean Energy Regulator under the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Safeguards Mechanism, Renewable Energy Targets and Emission Reduction Fund. So that's quite a mouthful there, Nicole. They're big jobs too.
Yes, I was surprised you didn't use the acronyms.
Too many acronyms.
Always a lot in ESG.
So, Nicole, first question to you. Why does the government want to introduce an electric vehicle road user charge in Australia?
Okay, so I guess this is really about equity. So it's ensuring that all road users contribute to road maintenance, as currently users of EVs avoid that fuel exercise. So we've seen that as vehicles become either more fuel efficient or don't need fuel at all, as in the case of EVs, the revenue collected from the fuel tax is dropping. There are some interesting facts in regards to the fuel excise. Fuel excise represents about 38% of all road-related revenue. Registration is about 30% and stamp duty 14%, while tolls and council rates make up the difference. So some other interesting facts. Total road-related revenue from all levels of government in 2023 was 31 billion. And total road expenditures from all levels of government in 2023 was 38.6 billion. So I guess this leaves about 7.7 billion in roads expenditure to come out of other taxes. So I guess there are details still missing on how this charge will be structured and who it will apply to and how it will be collected, which I guess we'll talk through today for the rest of the session.
And if I could just jump in, sorry, Andrew, if I could just jump in with a couple of additional figures, which might go towards, I guess, the impetus as to why a road user charge and why now. And as Nicole kind of touched on, we're at a point where the revenue from road user or from excises is declining in real terms or staying roughly steady. And part of the reason is there is an ongoing shift towards EVs. But there is also a shift towards more fuel-efficient vehicles. So leave aside the fact that we have vehicles that actually pay no excise. You also have greater distances being travelled You have more damage being done to roads, but you actually have less revenue being generated. So the current excise model is being seen as effectively broken, or at least not fit for purpose. Now, that doesn't necessarily create the business case for a road user charge, but it creates the need to consider an alternative to the current excise model, because in relative terms, as a percentage of total revenue that can be used towards more and more expensive roads, it's not generating anywhere near enough to be able to cover the entire reason it exists, which is for road maintenance. So that's part of the reason why we're having this conversation, is simply the excise model itself is not fit for purpose.
Now, how does that figure in, Sam, when we have the Australian Automobile Association asserting that over the decade to 2023, only 57% of fuel excise was reinvested in land transport projects. So they're essentially saying we're paying the excise and it's not actually going back into roads. Is that correct in your experience?
It's probably a fair comment, but it's a portion of the whole truth. So the money that's raised, despite the fact that the way the government's presented is this is money that is raised to then go into road projects, legally that's not how it works. Legally, the money is collected and it goes straight into consolidated revenue, which sits at the federal government level, which is then allocated towards road projects. So it's not dollar for dollar that money has to go towards road transport products. What we then have is, as Nicole touched on, is we actually have a range of different sources of revenue that go towards constructing and then maintaining roads. But we also have different levels of governments who are responsible for different types of roads. So the way you slice and dice these numbers is it's not like for like. It's quite a difficult exercise to say, well, if you're traveling, say for instance, on the Pacific Highway, how much of that is maintained by the federal government? You then take an off-road. How much of that is the state government? You then take a side road. How much of that is local government? So coming up with the numbers to maintain the entire road network and who's responsible for it is tricky.
Yeah, so as a road user and somebody who's not an expert in this area, I would have thought that the fuel excise all just goes to maintain the roads. But does it more correctly go towards building new roads, or is it for maintenance of old existing roads?
Well, in theory, it's supposed to go towards maintaining the existing road network. But the way the money goes is it just goes into a big pot for government. And so it can be spent, that money that is raised from excise can be spent building a hospital. It can be spent on any of the government priorities. It's not allocated constitutionally towards road projects. That's just, I guess, a notional way of thinking about why we're raising the tax. That's the reason the tax exists, but it's not the reason why that money that is raised is actually spent. They may not be the like for like.
And Nicole, you did mention an equity issue. So we are potentially faced with a situation where one group of road users is paying a lot more tax than the other. Regardless of what it's used for, we are taxing road users differentially at the moment. So yeah, that equity one is a good point. But how does this go towards impacting on our climate targets?
Definitely. I guess as we consider this road user charge for electric vehicles, it must definitely align with our climate targets. Most recently, the Australian government announced on 18 September that we have a new 2035 emissions reduction target, which marks a major step towards achieving that net zero by 2050. And we also have a net zero plan, which outlines how that target will be met. So considering that we have to get to, I guess, achieve our 2035 emissions, which it seems far away now, but it really isn't, we must carefully design this road user charge to avoid, I guess, penalizing, as I mentioned, those who drive less or those who live in rural areas. And we should also incentivize EV low emission vehicles. So I guess the best way is when considering this charge, it should be a universal distance-based charge that perhaps incorporates vehicle mass and emissions as well. And it should really reward low emission choices, ensure fairness across income groups. And this will also help, I guess, consider our broader sustainability objectives and will really help support our transition to net zero.
Yeah, so picking up on a point you made there, Do we think that this will be a universal charge, or will it only apply? So is this just the first part of a road user charge that will then extend? For example, we note that New Zealand has a charge on heavy vehicles. Sure, what's your view on that?
My personal opinion is that I believe it should be a universal charge because this will ensure that fairness across, I guess, all households, so lower income and high income households. And then this could made to be seen as the RUC as a fairer system.
Yeah, because there is an element of fairness in the excise on fuel in that the more you drive and use the roads, the more tax you pay. So it's a bit of a user pay. Do you think this could be the more you charge? Is there any thoughts on that? Tax the electricity supply, pay excise on electricity going into the vehicles?
I might just jump in with an observation just around the difference between excise and road user charge, which goes towards the point of fairness and equity. One of the issues with road user charge, with the current excise model and the way it's applied is, at the moment, it's applied to combustion engine vehicles, so petrol and diesel, not applied to EVs. Now, when you do the modelling, traditionally people who are on a higher socioeconomic income, they can afford the EVs. They get FBT exemptions, they get concessions in terms of rebates, they have higher incomes, they can afford the EV. So when you actually look at the distribution of who pays the excise, it's actually more at the lower end rather than the higher end. So leave aside the actual mechanics of how a road user charge would be applied. There's already an equity point here that people who can, I'll say, less afford to pay tax are in fact bearing a higher burden of the tax. So that's part of the reason for why something for EVs. Now, I guess I take the point around emissions, but when we then come to look at, well, the distance based, at the moment, there is a proxy between how much fuel you buy and how much you might travel, but it's not like for like. You could poorly maintain a vehicle, you will buy a lot more fuel and travel less distance. A more traditional or a more refined road user charge would generally link per kilometres travelled to the charge itself. So it may, as a very simple example, a road user charge could simply be on the 1st of January, you take a photo of your odometer, send that off to whichever revenue authority is going to look after this. 31 December same year, you'll send them another odometer reading. The differential between the two, you pay a rate per kilometre, which has a much stronger link between the actual distance charged compared to the current model, which typically rewards those cars that are more efficient to the point of being not taxed at all. So there is a closer linkage between the damage that a car may end up doing to a road and actually paying some of that. And the other point to note is that, as a very rough idea, your standard EV is generally heavier than your standard petrol or diesel engine car. And if you look at how much damage relative they are doing, it's generally going to be on the EV side compared. So at the moment, as I said, there's a case for change, and then there's a discussion to be had as to what does that change look like.
Okay, so a change away from excise tax to road user charge as a total solution.
Not a total solution, because there's still equity issues to play out here, which have been highlighted by various, I guess, stakeholders. So one issue may well be there are different segments of the community that may, for whatever reason, have to travel further. So if you're in a rural community, you may have to travel a further distance than someone who's sitting in the city. Does that mean that there are differential rates depending on which postcode you may start in, or whether there should be super rates if you're traveling in a CBD during peak hours? Whatever that might look like, I think there are still questions of equity that exist, even if you had a flat rate per kilometre, because it doesn't impact everyone equally.
There's some really good points there, Sam, and it's certainly got me thinking beyond the simple application of a flat charge or a fairly easy charge. So, yeah, arguably that would be yet another piece of lodgement into a government that is struggling to deal with the amount of bureaucracy at the moment. So there's some difficulties in administration. Nicole, do we have any evidence that these kind of charges make a difference in the adoption of electric vehicle?
Yeah, definitely. I think considering all of Sam's points and what we just discussed, there is a risk as well that if the charge is perhaps seen as too high, or implemented without considering those broader benefits, this will definitely hinder our transition to net zero, and also, I guess, our transition to low carbon mobility. And that really, as well, an adoption of EV vehicles. So I guess in order to meet our new climate targets, EV adoption is actually a central pillar of achieving them. So again, we need to make sure that this, I guess, sort of ensures fairness amongst all and rewards everyone, and really does support Australia's overall goals.
Yeah. So if we take that on board and then consider, trying to achieve those goals, but also recognising user pays approach to roads and the cost of maintaining them, are there any other ways that we could encourage EV adoption in the face of a charge?
Yeah. So I guess one option was how the revenue from this road user charge will be used. So I guess without any clear communication of how this will be used, the public could see this as just another revenue raising measure rather than something to support climate action. And then again, this could erode that trust and willingness for people to actually purchase an EV. So in terms of actually using the funds from that road user charge revenue, some ideas are maybe we could use it to actually invest in sustainability initiatives. So examples could be funding more EV charging networks, or ensuring put more, I guess, money into public transport, and I guess those road safety upgrades that we talked about as well. So within sustainability, if we see that circularity and that positive feedback loop, this will really help, I guess, maintain and support momentum from the public.
So finding other ways to make EVs attractive to use. Do we think that is there more of an impact from EVs, or maybe if it was more expensive to travel, it was a user-based charge or kilometre-based charge, as Sam was talking about, would less driving have more impact on our climate change goals? So less driving in general, because people are more conscious if there's a cost to the kilometres they drive. Would that have more of an impact on our climate goals than EVs themselves?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess if people are driving less and perhaps considering alternative transport modes like, public transport, cycling, even carpooling, this would definitely encourage users to have that sustainability focus in mind, and this would definitely help with achieving our goals.
Yeah. So thank you. If we now move away from individuals and consider, because we also have corporates that own vehicles as well. Sam, do you think this tax would affect companies moving into fleet electrification?
Yes, but you've got to look at the whole picture here. So the point I think you were raising before is almost a distinction or a trade-off between, do I still buy a petrol car, or do I move to an EV? Even under states already, so New South Wales, WA, and Victoria have previously tried to implement a road user charge, and I'll come back to Victoria's in a second. Even under the most, I'll say, generous model, the most that the average user was going to pay, roughly equivalent, was about $400 a year. Under the current model, a typical person will pay roughly about $1,200 in excise. So, like for like, if you were jumping in an EV relative to jumping in a standard petrol car, under the road user charge, at the rates that were being set, or you would be paying less. Now, that sends a signal to the market that EVs are a better choice relative to traveling in a petrol car. Also, bear in mind that outside of just the road user charge versus excise debate, there are a range of other incentives that were available both at the federal level and at the state level for incentivizing people to move away from petrol cars, or at least inefficient petrol cars, and moving towards full EVs. Now, you'd have the FBT exemptions, you've had direct cash rebates, you've had discounts on charging stations. So there's a range of other incentives. So there is on one hand, there is a mixed message here to say, hang on, we're going to start taxing EVs. Okay. But the other message is that the bigger picture is those incentives are available to EVs that are not available to other cars. The other point is that you forward model what the EV uptake over the next 15 to 20 years looks like. There is a critical point at which it's going to be very difficult to implement a road user charge once you've got 50 to 60% of the market in EVs relative to bringing it in now where roughly about 7 to 10% of the market is EV. So if you're going to do it early. That's where the government's trying to get to. And again, they can kind of figure a lot of the detail out as they go along and tweak it to the extent that there are any discrepancies and exemptions or carve-outs that need to be made. But what they wanted to do is to get ahead of trying to bring something in when the whole excise model falls down and you've got too many EVs on the road to start taxing them and they all vote, right? You know, there's a trade-off in terms of timing. The other thing I wanted to bring in is the Constitution. So this is it's not a castle type argument. The Constitution becomes relevant because the different states originally imposed or sought to impose excise. And an affected driver in Victoria took the case through to the High Court and had a win, which effectively said states cannot impose a road user charge of this nature because it's an excise. And excises under the Constitution can only be levied by the federal government. So as much as the federal government kind of sat back and happily let everyone else impose it, they're now the ones stuck with it going, well, we're the only ones that can now impose a road user charge because the states can't because they're constitutionally barred from doing so. So that's, as a collective, that's kind of created the case for change.
Okay, so really a bit of sticker shock there, just thinking a new charge will come in, but there is potentially still a relative cost advantage running an EV of about $800 a year when it comes to tax. I do like with a little bit of a cynical grin the view that bring it in now while it won't cost as many votes, arguably a sensible strategy from the government.
Purely my interpretation on RSMs.
Yeah. Oh, I tend to agree with it, Sam. I think it's a good observation. So, Nicole, looking at companies still, and companies have to, consider their decisions around emissions reporting. Will this influence those decisions?
Yes, certainly. So I guess if we do the introduction of this road user charge for EVs, it will most likely influence how companies do report. I guess if there are any increased costs, this may make companies closely monitor and actually consider the way that they use their fleet. And obviously, if the emissions number is sort of getting higher, the companies might actually look to reduce their emissions through other means. So they might look to purchase offsets. They could look at obviously other incentives within the business, lighting, how they recycle waste, those sort of initiatives. And they might, I guess, in terms of actually using fleet and vehicles, companies could actually explore optimizing delivery routes. Perhaps looking at, doing everything all in one go, or also partnering with other low emission transport providers. But essentially, in terms of emissions reporting, we need to make sure that, companies need to ensure that transparency is key, and it is really essential for maintaining credibility within emissions disclosures.
Yeah, so the really interesting points there on how it can change things. Do you think it will encourage innovation in EV design or even alternate fuels, Nicole?
Yes, certainly. So I guess as Sam mentioned before, EV vehicles are actually, more heavy. So there might be innovation considered in making them more lighter or looking at any other materials that could be used. There might also be other, research and investment into in alternative fuels, and perhaps other technologies that could also help further reduce emissions and operating costs.
Yeah, thank you. Sam, you have raised a few points and issues around it. If we go to your tax background, and can I ask you, do you think there's what are the difficulties in introducing this type of legislation.
So I'll leave the political discussion about how difficult it is to impose and create new taxes to one side. If we're just looking at the design of a road user charge, probably the fundamental point is around recording of the base of the tax. Now, if we use the base of the tax as the number of kilometres travelled, that's all well and good, but there's got to be a mechanism by which that is tracked. Now, as I said, one mechanism might simply be take a photo at the start, at the end. Now, the cynic in me suggests that you could well take photos at different points in time and say, well, that's my current odometer. What it could lead to, and this is, I guess, a follow-on suggestion. This goes back to road user charging is nothing kind of a new idea. This has been around for a long time. It's been mentioned in the Henry Review. It was something that was, I guess, an idea that was championed back in 2010 and kind of died a slow death. We're now talking about it again. Is we are now moving towards vehicles that are tracked. So without needing you necessarily to have any kind of friction point of actually doing anything, the government may well have access to your data, and it will know that you've travelled 1,000 kilometres this month, and it could then use that information to then just send you a check, or alternatively, just deduct it from your account, whatever that might look like. No, not overly dissimilar to a toll account. So there are a number of challenges in terms of calculating and capturing that information, but potentially we're moving to a model that suggests maybe it doesn't require you to do anything, and maybe it doesn't require the government to do anything through the use of data, whether you want to call it AI, whatever it might look like. We could end up with a fairly frictionless model, but there are a number of non-tax related issues that come with that. Leave aside the political privacy, for instance. Would you really want the government to have that access to knowing how far you're traveling, potentially where you're traveling, at what times you're traveling, if we decide to have different rates for different times to kind of manage traffic? So there's a range of non-tax issues with bringing some of those issues in. But the flip side is it fairer? Potentially, relative to excise, which has its challenges. It is. But, they're all issues for government to resolve.
Yeah, so we did note in the research for this that Iceland already has a charge as the only other jurisdiction with an EV charge. I think it's just an EV charge. They're talking about transitioning to in-vehicle units, which would be an interesting political proposition here in Australia to allow the government to track your vehicles. The other thoughts there are also around using like state averages, district averages, etc. And that would go a long way to what you were talking about before, Sam, which is around regional or country users versus city users. Do we think, asking both of you this, do we think there's a better alternative to increase the equity in who's paying for the roads?
Leave aside all the challenges. I do think a road user charge in its purest form provides the best opportunity for a fairer and more equitable system, overcoming all of those challenges I've noted before in terms of the regressive nature of excise, mentioning before around, the respective damage that certain vehicles do. You can have different rates for different types of vehicles, and making it relatively simple to administer if, for instance, we go down the path of government or another third party having access to specific data to be able to impose a tax. So in a pure sense, I think a road user charge makes sense, but there are obviously challenges with rolling it out, implementing it, and making sure it works for all segments of the market.
I think, yeah, agree with that. And I guess from the sustainability perspective, agree, there's definitely both those risks and opportunities. So I guess as we mentioned before, if it's structured poorly, it could discourage EV adoption, impact those lower income households, and perhaps even, slow down organizations or corporations changing to a fleet of EV vehicles. But if it is carefully designed with all those factors that we talked about, and if they are considered, then it can definitely support those behavioral shifts, and it can help drive innovation and also help us achieve our climate goals. So yeah, I don't know if there's a better alternative.
Yeah, like many taxation issues and equity issues, it's really complex, and what can appear to be quite a simple measure or a simple argument has a lot of layers to it. We're getting some online feedback about this, and the sentiment's mixed, and I would suggest It's probably more negative if you own an EV and more positive if you're watching EV owners not paying excise tax. And that's certainly anecdotal comment that we've received. And also it's arguments about whether it's fair, how to measure it, whether we should scrap it entirely and just raise revenue elsewhere. And there's certainly a lot of feedback about how it will be administered and the pain of doing that, tied in with concerns about the environmental commitments. Both of you have outlined a lot on those today. Really, overall, it's a really complex issue, and we are getting quite a simple solution. And generally, our view is that if it's done well, it can provide equity and fairness in taxation, because roads need to be paid for somehow. So thank you very much for joining us today for the Talk Big episode. I've been your host, Andrew Sykes. I encourage all of our listeners to subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your favourite, whatever your favourite platform is. Nicole and Sam, any last thoughts to add before we sign off for this episode?
The only last thought I have is it'll be interesting to see how quickly the government moves on this. None of this is new. None of this is, something that the governments didn't know about before. So the fact that we're still talking about implementing something 15 years after it was last suggested suggests that there's still a little bit to go.
Terrific.
Yeah, and I guess just from my point of view, I guess the success of this will depend on how well it integrates with our broader climate commitments. And from my perspective, I think if it integrates, it will be supported.
Terrific. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Nicole. And I'd invite our listeners to tune in to our next episode of Talk Big. Thank you for joining us on Talk Big. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Thank you.